Okay, hello to this session of the 50 Shades of Gothic conference series, the Gothic across genre and media and US popular culture. Today's topic is bodies and boundaries, and we're very happy to have Kyle Bishop here as our guest. I'll briefly introduce him and then we'll go to the interview. Kyle is professor of English at Southern Utah University, where he has been teaching since 2000. At that university, he teaches courses in American literature and culture, fantasy and horror lit, film studies, and English composition. Most of you will know that Kyle Bishop is the author of American Zombie Gothic, The Rise and Fall and Rise of the Walking Dead in Popular Culture, which came out in 2010, and a second volume on the zombies called How Zombies Conquered Popular Culture, The Multifarious Walking Dead in the 21st Century, which came out in 2015. We'll talk about those books a little later. And he's also the co-editor of The Written Dead, Essays on the Literary Zombie, which came out with McFarlane in 2017. So as you can see from his past publications, Kyle is very much a specialist on zombies, and that will also be the topic of our discussion here today. Thanks again, Kyle, for joining us for this virtual interview, keynote interview for our series here.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and asking me to participate. I'm very excited.
So are we, of course. Okay, so let's get this started. I'll start with a little bit of an easy one, sort of looking back at your past in zombie studies in a certain way. Now, you have been publishing on zombies basically for 15 plus years. Your first publication, called Raising the Dead, Unearthing the Non-Literary Origins of Zombie Cinema, was actually published in the Journal of Popular Film and Television back in 2006. A rather straightforward question. Does it actually become boring to study zombies, or is there something new you continue to discover while looking at new films, new media, new iterations of the zombie, and so on?
Well, I have to say that from time to time, I do get a little saturated. So if you look at my publication history, there's kind of feast and famine. I have to take little breaks now and then because I feel there come moments, and I think all scholars experience this, where I feel like, okay, I've said everything I have to say. I don't have anything else to add. And then, a year goes by and somebody makes a new movie, or I read a new book, or I go to a conference and I go to a session and I listen to some papers, and it sparks some new ideas and gets me kind of excited. But I do have to, well, I think I'm in a position in my career, luckily, where I don't have to do everything. I can wait until the right opportunity comes along. So I can take little breaks. And then when I come back to it, it's something new. It's something fresh that I want to do. And I feel that as a scholar who's entering into the latter half of my career, my obligation is maybe a little bit more on the mentoring and editing side of scholarship than the writing side or the first line scholarship. So I have been invested more as a general editor with McFarlane in trying to assist new scholars, putting together new works. Advantageously, just this morning, I received a proposal from someone who has a book manuscript on The Walking Dead. So there are still things to say, but I'm very comfortable with the fact that I don't have to be the one to say them all. I can just be involved in the process. That said, I did write something new for a conference this year, and I was a little surprised because I didn't know if I had anything new to say. But thanks to some new films, I have a new idea. So it just kind of has to work that way from time to time.
Since you basically teased that, what's that new idea, if you just want to sort of say a couple of sentences on that?
Oh, sure. I'm really invested in the portrayal of fatherhood in zombie fiction. For years, it was, well, parenting in general took a bad rap in zombie movies. Parents were often horrible. They killed their children or their children killed them. And there wasn't a lot of exploration of that. And being a father myself, as I grow a little bit older, I become more interested in paternity and issues of paternity. And in the last 4 years, we've seen a dramatic increase in heroic father figures, not only in zombie films, but post-apocalyptic narratives as well. And my basic thesis is that more and more of the creators of these narratives are fathers. And so that's what they're invested in. But I think there's a little bit more to it than that. And I do like the heroic father in horror films as something of a counterpoint to the monstrous mother, which has been very thoroughly established over the decades. So I'm kind of teasing out what that means, and if these zombie films have something to teach us besides just shoot them in the head. It would be nice if this genre that I love so much had some value beyond entertainment. So that's what I'm delving into.
That sounds interesting. I'm sort of kind of from my own position as primarily a video gamer. I'm primarily actually thinking of the Walking Dead video game in that context, and of course also The Last of Us. And I know that you've written about The Last of Us, so I guess those video games might also play into that entire research corpus, if you will.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool, cool. Now, we've already hinted at the fact that zombies and also monstrous mothers in a certain way are, of course, these monstrous figures, these embodiments of horror in a certain way. And as I mentioned before, this interview is part of the session on Gothic bodies. So bodies in relation to horror and the Gothic. Can you maybe say a little bit about the significance of zombie or zombified bodies in relation to the Gothic and horror? Why are they so important as particular bodies?
Yes, I'd love to speak to this. I was working on zombie narratives in my PhD program, and props to the University of Arizona, because this was 20 years ago, and they were very supportive that I said I wanted to do an English degree with an emphasis on zombie narratives. They said go for it, and I think part of that is Jerry Hogel works there, and he's a very influential scholar in terms of the Gothic. And when I began working with him, he said, look, if you're going to make this work, you have to root it in a literary tradition. And he helped me see that the zombie is pretty essentially Gothic in a way that scholars hadn't explored prior to that moment. And so I do owe him a debt of gratitude. I think of all the monsters, kind of the literary and movie monsters that we celebrate so much, I would dare say zombies are the most Gothic, even more so than vampires and even ghosts, even though ghosts are they have the longest pedigree in terms of the Gothic. But zombies are so Gothic because they present their antiquation. They don't appear as they did in life, they appear as they do in death. And so often ghosts appear in some kind of idealized form, or they appear as they did the moment of their demise. We watched Stardust this weekend, and I recall those rather Gothic ghosts in that film. Vampires are so idealized, especially recently, where they become almost angelic or godlike. Zombies are corpses. They remain corpses. And in a lot of the narratives, they continue to rot and to decay. And so it's that ever-present, unavoidable reminder of mortality that is at the heart of so many Gothic narratives, where the zombie then incorporates, and I mean that dually, incorporates the ideals of the Gothic, the key concerns of the Gothic, and present them in a way that cannot be masked or avoided. So they have this deadness to them that works in Freudian terms, and I use a lot of Freud in my scholarship, because they are literally the return of the repressed. They're the dead that come back. We don't want to think about death, so death returns to us. Now, vampires do that, but vampires do it in a way that reminds us of our bestiality, our mortality, our sexuality, but not so much our corporeality, and not so much this sense of the sense of the grotesque, which is often key to the Gothic. The zombie is grotesque. It's essentially grotesque, and I prefer manifestations of the zombie that are visibly dead, more so than another piece I'm working on right now is about zombie passing. And zombie passing is interesting because of the parallels to the racial tradition of passing. But those types of zombies aren't as Gothic. If they can pass as living humans, they don't have this tangible quality. The other key that I think is the zombie becomes so atavistic, so ferocious, so feral. And that's another thing that I think the Gothic reveals is this, it reveals the fantasy that we as humans have that we're civilized. And a lot of post-apocalyptic narratives explore this, notably Cormac McCarthy's The Road, any of the Road Warrior films, etc. That when push comes to shove, we are monstrous creatures ourselves. We will tear and rend and bite and fight for survival, just like animals will. And because zombies, particularly post-Romero zombies, are so much presented as flesh eaters, cannibalistic flesh eaters, it reveals that repressed secret as well. So in terms of Hogel's understanding of the Gothic, particularly in terms of Freudian psychoanalytic theory, that's what the zombie really is. It's an antiquated body that reveals the repressed truths of our mortality and our monstrosity. And it puts us on a stage that reveals anything. And that's what I love about the zombie. And we'll probably talk about that a little more in a minute. But zombies can be whatever they need to be. And I love that. That's the whole premise of my second book, is they are metaphorical monsters, like all monsters, as Cohen reminds us, but they get to do it with a little bit of flexibility that the other monsters don't always enjoy. And I think that flexibility is always inherently Gothic at its heart.
Yes, I think that's a very important point. The sort of the deadness that's very much embodied by the zombie that you highlighted so expertly. Now that they confront us with our mortality, and so more so than other Gothic creatures very much do. And you already hinted at the fact that, of course, these are topics that more or less reverberate throughout both of your monographs in one way or another. Your first book more so on the history of the zombie and early and 20th century iterations of zombie representations, and the second book then focusing more on 21st century, the sort of zombie surge that hit us post 9/11 in a certain way. And as you also hinted at, you essentially start your first book, actually, American Zombie Gothic, by sort of stressing that point that all cultural production kind of speaks to a given society's dreams, but also anxieties, of course, and that the Gothic plays a very particular role in this context. And you also mentioned George Romero's Night of the Living Dead at least once already as a sort of a key zombie text of the 1960s, of course. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about, or could you mention 3 key zombie texts of key historical moments in the United States in particular, and what they tell us about the society that they were embedded within?
Absolutely. So I think everybody in zombie studies would agree that Night of the Living Dead is it. That is where George Romero really shifted everything kind of permanently, because prior to 68, zombies manifested in narratives that were more true to their origins from Haiti, where they were enslaved, they were servants of other more malevolent powers. They didn't do a whole lot. And so the fear wasn't of zombies, the fear was of becoming a zombie. And then Romero, by fusing the zombie with a little bit of vampirism and a whole lot of Middle Eastern ghoul mythology, came up with his ghoul, which others retroactively named the zombie. And it created this creature, which was more than just a kind of a post-colonial figure of racial enslavement, and became the embodiment of unchecked modern desire, an empty desire, by the way, which is what's so key. Romero was responding to a cultural anxiety that had been brought to the fore primarily because of the Vietnam War, not exclusively, but I think primarily because that was the first war that was televised. And so people, the American people in the United States were seeing images of death and destruction on a level that they never encountered before. And so Romero was able to draw on existing narratives, such as The Birds, such as Invasion of the Body Snatchers, these kind of quintessential sci-fi horror texts. And he created something really, really interesting, which was a creature that would remind people of their mortality, of their fragility, but also play on current social issues and concerns about the literal assault on the family, the assault on the kind of traditional home, and also to engage in issues of race and racism and the shifting attitudes in the United States towards race. Romero went to his grave saying that he never intended it to be a film about race relations, but by casting his lead as a Black man, he kind of irrevocably did just that, where somewhat transgressively, he had a Black hero, but he had a Black hero who didn't always act particularly heroic, and simultaneously confirmed and overturned assumptions, racist assumptions about a Black man. And so it became a really touchstone moment and a turning point in horror narratives, I think, because it was so raw and so basic, but at the same time, it was making so many sophisticated comments about society in 1968. Not coincidentally, the year the United States Production Code was retired and filmmakers were allowed to really push the envelope, as he had people eating actual offal on camera. It was pretty revolutionary and pretty shocking. And so that film changed the zombie for the next 40 years. And so most of the zombie films you see in America and a lot of the ones you see in England and in Italy followed Romero's lead with these infectious, like vampires, cannibalistic, like ghouls, but a new type of zombie that continued to explore the idea of loss of agency, but did so in a much more visceral way, I think. So there's lots of great films that came out, and I've written about them, and a lot of people listening, I'm sure, are familiar with them as well. So I think the next one that we have to really look at is The Walking Dead, because The Walking Dead is a huge phenomenon that has transcended Romero's humble intentions, I think, by quite a ways. The Walking Dead was a successful comic, but when it became a TV series on AMC, it just exploded. It broke records left and right about viewership. And it was the type of narrative that I think most would have doubted would ever succeed in a public forum. Up until that point, the zombie was really kind of a B movie, VHS, watch it in your basement, late time television creature. And with The Walking Dead, it really went mainstream, prime time. And it gave birth to video games, as you've mentioned, and to spin-off shows and this whole world of The Walking Dead, which is really Romero's Walking Dead. The apocalyptic world is a Romero world. The zombies are Romero zombies. They're flesh eaters, they're contagious, they're slow moving, they're only dangerous in large numbers. And what really is important about The Walking Dead, building on Romero as well, is the true monsters of that series, of that franchise, aren't the zombies. The zombies they're helpless victims. They're doing what comes naturally. They're animalistic, they're atavistic. The thing that's really scary about that Gothic landscape are the humans that will do anything to survive. A zombie has no sense of morality because a zombie has no agency. Humans do. And so the humans in The Walking Dead are really terrifying. They're ferocious, they're vicious, both the protagonists as well as the antagonists, which is what makes the narrative so compelling. Because what you would do to survive that scenario, you would have to become a monster yourself. And I've written about that, referencing Nietzsche, this idea that the one thing you want to avoid when fighting monsters is becoming one yourself. And I think The Walking Dead shows that that's impossible. True monstrosity can only be confronted by equally severe monstrosity. And so I think it's important to note that The Walking Dead really took off on the heels of September 11th. Again, trauma, national trauma, televised violence, it makes sense that we would get this first big bubble of the zombie with Vietnam, and the second, what I and others now call the zombie renaissance, on the heels of September 11th. So those, I think, are the two most important things to recognize. Now, you asked for a third, so this is where I want to be a little more unexpected. So I want to talk about Maggie, because Maggie is a movie that kind of got ignored. It's a kind of an independent film, but what makes it so interesting is it stars Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he did this film for free. He loved the script so much, and he wanted to give it a shot because it does put him against type. He's supposed to be, and I think he actually pulls it off, but he's supposed to be kind of a simple small town farmer who isn't a juggernaut like the Terminator. He's not a highly trained military offensive. He's just a dad. He's a dad who's trying to survive a new world in which a zombie plague has ravaged society. And it becomes a movie that is much more about family, and it's much more about individuals than it is about apocalypse. It's a pretty quiet film with a really small cast, and you only see a handful of zombies throughout the entire movie. But of course, the point is the title character, Maggie, Abigail Breslin, is a zombie. And the scenario of this film isn't so much Romero as kind of a 28 Days Later situation, where zombieism is a plague, it's an infection, but the zombies spend weeks transforming. It takes about 6 weeks for someone to fully die from the infection and to come back as a zombie. And so society has set up a quarantine system, they've set up detention centers, and they've come up with a system for euthanizing the dead before they become a threat for the living. I think those issues resonate perhaps more so now than when the film was made, because we do have a plague, and we do see the mistreatment of those who are infected, and we do see the incarceration of the innocent. And I think all that stuff really resonates, and perhaps Maggie is a more important film now than it was 6 years ago. But at its heart, it's a film about a dad who loves his daughter who's terminally ill and refuses to accept that. And I think it's a touching film. It's quiet, it's sensitive, it's sad, and it's not an action adventure horror film like so many of the other zombie movies. And so that's why I think it's important, because it represents the types of narratives that the zombie figure can tell in a way that tells it very, very well. So I do want to shout out to that film and encourage folks to check it out.
Yes, indeed. And as I think you know, I'm sort of sitting like 5 miles from where Arnie was born. So there's also some sort of, local touch there from my very Austrian perspective here. So there's that. I appreciate the pointer at that, as you were saying, underappreciated film. But you also raised two important points that I also wanted to touch upon still. On the one hand, the sort of post 9/11 surge in zombie films, the zombie renaissance, as you and others have called it, and then also the sort of the meaning of the zombie in our pandemic times in a certain way. So let's move along chronologically or historically, if you will, looking back at the post 9/11 zombie renaissance, which you, as mentioned before, also very much touch on in your second monograph. So what do you think were reasons, other than this sort of national trauma in the United States, of course, that triggered the sort of zombie renaissance in the early 21st century? Because as we know, it not only sort of affected the United States sort of in the post 9/11 moment, but at the end of the day, it also seemed to spread across the globe. It became a kind of global phenomenon in the early 21st century. What were reasons for that?
Well, yeah, I think 9/11 in the United States really helped to kick off the viability of these narratives. And so you do get a number of films right out of the gate, and then a lot more to follow. And that did expand a little bit more globally with this kind of war on terror that the United States perpetuated. But curiously enough, horror films and zombie films are not only catalyzed by warfare, they also appear during economic hardship. So the 30s, at least in the United States, but you see it a little bit more globally as well. The 30s were a huge decade for horror. And it wasn't because of war, it was because of economic depression. And the Great Depression in the United States did resonate worldwide and did have global impact. And so the United States film industry started making a lot of horror films because, in super reductive terms, when times are tough, you want a narrative about people for whom times are tougher. And it kind of makes you feel better. It's very cathartic. And so I think one of the things that really kicked off the zombie renaissance was that we also saw an economic crisis, an economic collapse that was global. And of course, we also have become a much more global world than we were in the 30s or in the 60s, into the 70s, really. And so I think that's one of the reasons why zombies were able to proliferate so quickly, is everybody was kind of struggling at the first part of the 21st century. And because of the internet, because of globalization, it was much easier to share stories. It was much easier for people in other countries to access the films of other countries, to access comic books. To the video game market is huge to the zombie renaissance, because zombies were flourishing in video games since the 90s. They make such a great foe because you can shoot people and not feel guilty about it. So I think all that kind of combined. But then there were other things that were happening. We also, as a world, as a globe, we got really nervous about infection, because right after 9/11, we had swine flu, we had cow flu, we had avian flu, we had weaponized anthrax. All that stuff went down in just a couple of years. We had problems with immigrants. We had problems with refugees. We had militarized conflicts all over the place. And that level of diverse trauma and anxiety came together to produce a pretty potent world for a horror revival. So, not talking about the zombies at all, it's interesting to me that almost every major horror film from the 1970s was remade during the first decade of the 21st century. The time was ripe, and it was the parallels between then and the 70s, the economic hardship, the warfare, it really came together again. What made the zombie, I think, particularly essential for this moment was its versatility. Vampires are still around, and I love vampires too. But vampires had shifted. They're still monsters, but they're more often than not romantic heroes, superheroes. So the vampires become a lot of different things. The zombie is also on that trajectory, by the way, but I think that initially in the 21st century, it was the figure we could use for whatever we needed to use it for. And that's really the thesis of my second monograph. The idea of the zombie as a multifarious monster. It's a meaning machine that can mean whatever the filmmaker or author or video game designer wants it to be. And so I've been thinking a lot about zombie films as genre, but the fact that the zombie shows up in other genres makes me think that maybe it isn't a genre at all. It's an element, it's a monster, it's a trope, it's a thing that can be added to almost any story genre or tradition. So if you look at what we've gotten over the last 20 years, you still mostly have zombie horror films. And I've been watching a ton of those in the last 2 weeks as I'm preparing for another conference. But you see zombie crime dramas, you see zombie action adventure films, you see zombie superhero comics, you see zombie sitcoms, you see zombies that are mostly political satire, you see fan films on YouTube that are better than Romero's first movies were, cultural allegories. The zombie shows up all over the place now. And you see really great zombie films outside of the United States. And as I've been trying to survey the key zombie films for the last 2 or 3 years. The majority of them are not from the US, which I think is really great and really important. Frankly, the best zombie films right now are coming out of Asia. and a number out of Australia for reasons that I haven't quite figured out. US zombie production is still going strong, but there's a lot of recycling and there's a lot of riding the Walking Dead horse. Uh, Internationally, we're getting more interesting zombie films for sure. And they're evolving because the zombie is like any other animal. It has to evolve and adapt or it's going to die. And so I do talk about zombies in terms of Darwin a lot. They need to be able to be more than they are. And the zombie gets to do that easier than other monsters because they don't have hundreds and hundreds of years of tradition. They don't have a Gothic literary tradition the way the vampire does. And so to me, zombie has become a shorthand. Everybody basically knows what the zombie is. So anybody who wants to tell a zombie story can start there. But since zombies aren't real, they can go any direction they want to, and audiences will buy it. I just finished Santa Clarita Diet, which I had put off because I didn't think I'd like it very much. I loved it. It's not a particularly Gothic version of the zombie, but it's a great use of that creature to tell a certain story. And so that's why I'm excited that we're still seeing new original creative works to explore global issues of anxiety and fear, but also catharsis, definitely catharsis.
Speaking of, since you basically provided the key here already, global issues of, and especially global anxieties. I mean, we're living in a sort of pandemic age. Do you see another, I mean, you sort of pointed at the fact that international and global zombie cinema has been thriving, especially in the last couple of years with the US kind of more recycling, as you were saying. Do you see another surge coming up in the next couple of years, sort of triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I think we're going to. We're going to see a surge in all infection narratives. And the zombie, in so many ways at its heart, is an apocalyptic story. It's a viral narrative. And so, yeah, I think I think people are probably already working on it. I imagine that there's a number of screenwriters and authors who've been quarantined, who are looking out their window, who are looking on the TV, and they're seeing real life plot elements and story devices. And I think we're going to get a COVID version of the zombie. At the very least, people are going to be more invested in these narratives because they're going to feel like they've been through it. Now, obviously, we haven't. Obviously, the coronavirus isn't a zombie virus. The death toll is nowhere near as high as in post-apocalyptic narratives like The Stand. But it's enough that people have woken up to our fragility as a society. And it's a rough time to be a citizen of the United States because we entered this pandemic with such arrogance. And now, of course, we're the country that has been hit the worst. We're the country that has the most fatalities because we botched it. And I think that failure to respond to the virus correctly, I think the amount of death people have experienced, maybe not firsthand, but definitely secondhand, thirdhand. Pretty much everybody in the United States knows somebody who died. And I know that that's similar in other countries around the world. You can't have that kind of national, and in this case, global trauma without having art reflect it. And if we saw a surge in horror narratives because of September 11th, what are we going to see from this where the death toll is astronomically higher? So I think, yeah, starting in the next year, once productions can start to work again, once people can go back to work, we're going to see a ton of these. We're going to see a post-apocalypse. We're going to see infection, viral narratives. We're going to see exposés. We're going to see, we're going to see docudramas that are going to try to reveal what went wrong. And we're going to see zombies. We're going to see lots and lots of zombies. And I'm pretty excited about that. If we can do it differently, if we can do things that are new and exciting and change the script a little bit. So the United States, it's now their turn to take cues from other countries. and to do more than just remake foreign films, but to actually make new films with new narratives. And I'm feeling pretty optimistic that the zombie isn't done. We have a collective global trauma that needs therapy, and horror films are, in my mind, the best therapy out there. Horror narratives are there, and so people are going to get to work if they haven't already.
And of course, we will read past horror films and zombie narratives in a different light as well. So there's also that dimension. Since we have already been speculating about the future in a certain way, as a sort of closing question here, from a more scholarly perspective, you were saying that filmmakers, creators essentially will make sort of take new paths, will do things differently in the future with a reference to COVID-19. Also, as sort of an editor for McFarlane in the Zombie Studies series, do you see the field of zombie studies taking a different route? Is there something exciting that you see emerging in recent months or even in the last year or so that you feel like this is the way zombie studies will move in the next 5 years or so?
This is such a great question because I wish I had all the answers to it. Because I don't know if I have another zombie book in me, but I definitely know that zombie books are continuing to be pitched and promoted and developed. I was an external reader for a zombie monograph last month. Like I said, I just received a proposal for a manuscript today. I think as we continue to get more and more zombie narratives, we're going to find new ways to approach those. And as literary production increases, so does scholarly interest. Because having been a graduate student twice, I know that grad students are always desperately trying to find something new to do, something new to say. And they're going to increasingly look at contemporary trends and contemporary narratives. And so, as you just said, reconsidering existing zombie narratives through the lens of a post-COVID world is going to afford a host of different readings, where you say, okay, but what happened when it really took place? That's going to happen. I think people are going to continue to try to explore the zombie from new critical perspectives. For race has been done substantially in terms of zombies, but not as much on gender, not as much on, like I said, like on parenting, not so much on queer studies or disability studies, the zombie as a disabled body. That's going to become increasingly more relevant. But it's this globalization that I think is key. I don't know of a critical academic zombie text on the Italian zombie film. And the Italian zombie tradition is fascinating and very extreme. And that hasn't really been done. There's so much happening in Asia that hasn't been explored thoroughly. The idea of the zombie surfacing in previous colonial nations like Australia hasn't been touched too much. Zombie-like folklore and mythologies hasn't been developed very much. I've written a little bit about the Optaganger in Norway, but not a lot has been done with the Draugr up in Scandinavia. Not much has been done with some of the Chinese or the Japanese versions of the zombie. So I think we're going to see more. I think there's more to be said. I think there's more to be explored. And I think the globalization, the international exploration, the folkloric origins, there's still a lot to be said. People still have things to say about The Walking Dead as a specific text. So I think there's still plenty to be said about the zombie as a whole. So we want to look at probably the most important thing to me right now is zombies as protagonists, zombies featuring in comedies, zombies that are more sympathetic and more emotional. These are the things we haven't explored as much, and I'm fascinated to see what other non-horror zombies are out there and what they mean. Because the zombie can be just as important for cultural study as the horror zombie, although scholars generally discount comedy anyway. And I think zombie comedies are saying things that are super interesting that could be explored in more depth. I don't know if I'm going to do it, but hopefully somebody out there listening will send me and McFarland a few manuscripts to check out.
That was a great call for especially junior scholars who we hope to reach in particular with this series. If you have a manuscript on zombie studies that's new, send it in Kyle's direction. Thanks so much for this interview. Thanks for taking the time and your insights on zombie studies and the entire field of horror studies, of course. This was a great experience.
Thanks for having me. I was so glad to talk with you. I'm a big fan of your culture.
Anna wanted to hear you in German, but that's maybe something for the post-recording session. I think that means we will move to the Q&A part if there are any questions from the folks who are present here. Monica Fernandez was the first to raise.
Hi, hello. Thank you for answering our questions, Kyle. Thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and thank you, Michael, as well. I'd like to ask you a question, like maybe bringing the topic a bit to my personal interests. You have mentioned, as well as every scholar on zombies, the Caribbean origin of, let's say, the myth, the creature. And I was wondering if in your work you have actually looked at works coming from the Caribbean by Caribbean creators. I don't know. I can think of a short story, but I'm not very familiar with them, so I'm just curious.
No, that's a great question. I have to go to my bookshelf. So my friend Sarah Lauro's The Transatlantic Zombie. This is the book on the Caribbean zombie narrative. She is an amazing scholar. She's quite much smarter than I am, but she traveled to Haiti to do a lot of research firsthand, which I haven't done. And she's been able to explore a literary tradition that's a little bit richer than I think any of us initially thought. With my work, I did touch on it a little bit, but I kind of worked on a kind of secondary level through the scholarship of Zora Neale Hurston and some other key Haitian scholars, where I did look into the origins of the idea of the zombie in Haitian life. The zombie is kind of a misinterpretation of voodoo culture and voodoo rituals. But I mostly looked at how that was translated into the cinema of the United States. I have looked at some of those short stories, but there are more, and they're more recent, that deal with the Caribbean zombie and the zombie as victim of a nefarious agent. I don't feel super qualified with it, and that's why I've stepped back a little bit. And then when Sarah published this book and I read it, I kind of said, well, I'm out, because I can't compete with that. But I don't think that she's done all the scholarship that remains to be done. And there are narratives that could be explored through the lens of zombie scholarship, such as Wide Sargasso Sea, which I think could be read as a type of zombie narrative, not a literal zombie narrative. And then other more overt zombie stories that have come out of the Caribbean, particularly out of Haiti, but also in places like Florida and Louisiana that have a strong Creole culture. I am not super well versed in it, but if you haven't read this one, read this, and it will give you a launching point for stories to read, authors to follow, and new scholarship to produce. Because since she wrote that, I'm pretty certain there have been a number of those types of narratives produced and published.
I'm going to read that 100% now. It's very, very inspiring answer. Yeah, I was really thinking that maybe, as you mentioned, White Sargasso Sea, it's not, it maybe takes a different form that we can analyze through some scholarship. So it's really fascinating topics, just given me, I feel like starting a new thesis now. But yeah, thank you very much. I'll write down the information about the book and certainly keep researching.
Awesome. Yeah, the zombie is used as a metaphor so often. I think zombie scholars need to embrace that. And zombie scholarship can be about more than just zombies. The metaphor is so widely reaching. It's a reason why we call things zombies that aren't. And I think that I think the scholarship can go that direction as well.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Monica.
Don't you just love that, the picking up books from the shelf from behind of you, also in office hours nowadays. This is so neat. Anna was next.
Hello again. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. And actually, while you were talking, I got two questions, but let's start with the first one. You talked about different kinds of zombie narratives, and I for one, really enjoy what I call incognito monster narrative. I really like when monsters need, want, or just can hide monstrosity and pretend that they are normal, which happens more often with vampires, of course, but it happens with zombies too. And I really liked, for example, The Girl with All the Gifts. I binge and stuff like iZombie, Santa Clarita Diet. I'm thinking maybe in a way The Glitch as well, The Return as well. So do you think that there is a change in the zombie or undead narrative dynamics, messages, tropes, when the zombie or the undead is to an extent human passing, if you see what I mean?
Yeah. No, I think that's a cycle that we get with monsters, because and it's all kind of building on the vampire tradition, because even if you go back to Polidari's The Vampire, the power of the vampire as a monster is its ability to pass as a human, to walk amongst us. And that's what's so terrifying about Dracula, the idea that this Eastern European monster would dare invade Europe and that it could walk the streets with impunity. I think that that's really key. And so for a long time, the zombie was so markedly visually different from human, there was no mistaking it. But that narrow focus on the zombie limits the stories that can be told. And so you're absolutely right. In the 20th century, we didn't have the passing zombie at all. In the 21st century, we've shifted because, and I think this is human nature, people love monsters, and then they love monsters so much, they don't want to other them, they want to become them. They want to embrace the monster, and they want to be able to love the monster more. And so the zombie is kind of following in the footsteps of the vampire, particularly as treated by Anne Rice, where we're going to make the zombie a little bit more identifiable, more sympathetic, give it more access to the human experience. And when I first started my research, I have to admit, I did not like that trend, and I really resisted it, because once you gave a zombie a voice, once you gave a zombie a consciousness and agency, to me, that seemed fundamentally opposed to the origins of the zombie as depicted in Haitian mythology. But I've kind of changed my mind. All the texts that you just mentioned, I think are really, really fascinating. iZombie explores a lot of interesting ideas about what would it take for a monster to be human, to retain humanity, and to function within society. And how do you differentiate between monsters that are monstrous and monsters that are trying to be less monstrous? I really enjoyed Santa Clarita Diet because the passing in Santa Clarita Diet is easy. It's probably the easiest of the narratives, because once they arrest the decomposition, they still look and act human. They just have this kind of secret side to them. I think the best narrative that has explored this is In the Flesh, the BBC series that had 2 seasons. where zombies had the ability to pass, but had to confront whether or not that was right for them. The resistance to passing is perhaps more interesting to me than the passing itself. But I think that's where we're going to get some really, really interesting stories, because then we have to ask ourselves, what is monstrosity? And human monstrosity can be manifested in zombie narratives by the uninfected humans. And you can get narratives in which the zombies are in fact more humane than the humans.
Yeah.
And then you get the narratives where there are different types of zombies. And that's one thing I haven't mentioned yet. Increasingly, we're getting stories where there are at least two very different types of monsters. You get it in Colson Whitehead's Zone 1. You get it in Warm Bodies. You get it in Girl with All the Gifts, which, again, like you said, it's amazing. It's a fascinating narrative. The book is much better than the film, but the film's also has a lot of interesting things happening in it. And so the idea of the monster versus the human monster, I've messed myself up there. I think that's super interesting. And I think there's a lot to be said. And I think there's a lot to be done with the zombie vampire comparison, because you usually don't get both in the same story. You do sometimes, but you rarely get them together. And I think more exploration of crossovers would be worth investigating.
Yeah, and that would have been my third question. Because I've seen that there are a few now that have this crossover between vampire and monster, like Van Els in the series, that you don't really know if they are zombies or vampires. They act a bit like zombies, a bit like vampires. And is that a trend or?
Well, it's a trend, but it's also the origin, because Night of the Living Dead is an adaptation of I Am Legend. And so Romero was working with vampires conceptually when he started. It's such an interesting thing to me, because Romero kind of accidentally invented the zombie, but he started with the vampire. But what he did is, he's like, the communicability of the vampire is super cool. And the idea of a monstrous apocalypse is super cool. But drinking blood wasn't enough for Romero. He wanted them to eat everything, which is the ghoul. And so I think that I think the lines are being blurred increasingly, because when you look at the most recent version of I Am Legend with Will Smith, they're basically zombies, but they're photosensitive like vampires. Which brings us, of course, to Minecraft, where the zombies don't act like zombies at all. They act more like vampires. And I don't know why the skeletons are photosensitive, but that's another issue. I think we are going to get more crossover, because traditionally we've had a lot of vampire werewolf stuff, really, since the Universal days. And so it would be interesting to see, is zombieism vampirism? How are they similar? How are they different? Because in a lot of ways, iZombie is a vampire narrative, not a zombie narrative. Those zombies they're vampires. They have to eat to survive. They have to eat to stay young or to look normal, to maintain their humanity. But it builds off of the John Rousseau version of the zombie, which is brain eating only. Vampires are blood drinking only. Santa Clarita Diet, she eats everything with gusto. So are we going to see different variations like that? Absolutely, absolutely. And the more monsters fuse and cross and meld, the more interesting things get. And taxonomy of monstrosity is going to become increasingly challenging. But you see the same thing in genre. Genre is increasingly difficult to identify. And I think monsters are going to become the same thing. They're going to follow the same trajectory, which is cool for scholars, but it's even cooler for fans.
And on a very, very briefly, on a totally different kind of narrative, you were mentioning Italian zombies. And why do you think they are so extreme? I mean, I watched many, and to be honest, my favorite Italian zombie movie is The Cemetery Man, della morte dell'amore, but because it's, I don't know, it's so weird and quirky, and it's just so very Dylan Dog kind of comic thing. But what do you think the other zombie Italian movies are so, I don't know, I find them quite gory. I find them quite scary.
Well, Italy had the cannibal film tradition in a way that no other country did. And Italy was not limited by the production code restrictions the United States was limited by. And so some of those early Italian cannibal films are just shocking. And so I think that that was the foundation upon which they built their own zombie tradition. And so the second thing is Fulci. Fulci by himself did it. He ripped off Dawn of the Dead. He made an unofficial sequel to it by calling his first zombie film Zombie 2, which is hilarious. But he was building on an established Italian cannibalist tradition. And so Fulci initially wanted gore that substantially transcended Romero's gore. Because even after the production code, Romero had to make films for a US audience, which was limited by the MPAA rating system. Fulci didn't. And Fulci had a built-in audience that expected gallons and gallons of blood and flesh ripping and these kind of horrifying moments. And back in 2006, 2007, when I watched all the Italian zombie films I could get my hands on, it was pretty shocking. There was a learning curve for me to kind of accept that different paradigm than we have in the United States. And so I think that would be my kind of short answer. It's the pre-established cannibal film tradition in Italy, followed by Fulci's single-handed vision of where the zombie would go. And other filmmakers in other nations have followed his lead more than Romero's, where it is this sense of true grotesque barbarism and an embrace of the atavism that you get from some Gothic narratives. And so I think the Italian Gothic is different from the US Gothic in many ways.
Yeah, I think I personally find it very interesting because, you know, I can see how usually Italian cinema is perceived from outside of Italy. You know, we have Fellini, we have a certain kind of cinema tradition. And then you have these, I don't know, Deodato, I mean, Cannibal Holocaust, it is a gory movie. It's scary, it's shocking. And I think, yeah, I think you're right. It just probably built on that kind of streak of whatever happened there, and it was just building on it. Well, thank you.
No, thank you, Anna.
Next one was Laura.
Hello. First of all, let me join my colleagues and thank you for your very interesting answers and for being here with us today. I was wondering, and you did briefly mention it toward the end of your answers with Michael, and about the role of zombies in comedy movies. And this is something that we've seen for several years, I guess, with Shaun of the Dead, but that's already from the early 2000s, but also more recent movies. I was thinking specifically of Anna and the Apocalypse, which is not only a musical, but also like a Christmas movie, and The Dead Don't Die, and movies like this. And I was specifically wondering whether you think that the zombie is a monster that lends itself to be used in these ways of dealing with fears through comedy, through laughing, because it's these movies are not necessarily less scary or less gory, and they're very dire. Many of these comedy zombie movies have very bad endings, like, you know, everybody's gonna die. It doesn't mean that they're happier in any way. So that was my question.
I think it's a great question. I'm glad you mentioned Anna and the Apocalypse, which I think is a really great film because it tries to be everything. It's like every genre at the same time. Comedy and horror are so closely related in lots of ways because fear response and humor response are, we manifest them similarly. We cry when we're scared, but we cry when we're happy. We can laugh when we're scared. And I think that's all really, really interesting. And I think the zombie comedies, the zombies can, like you say, they can still say important things and they can still help us wrestle with anxieties and fears, and they can still be Gothic. The Gothic comedy isn't new to zombies. This idea of we're going to turn it on its head and we're going to explore it through comedy. What is essential for any comedy, I think, is familiarity. And I think that's why early zombie films weren't particularly comedic, or early zombie comedies weren't particularly successful. In order to parody something, you have to have an audience familiarity with the rules and the tropes and the conventions, so then you can turn them on their head. And so while there were comedies in the 80s, I was a teenage zombie, which is not great. And the Night of the John Rousseau films, sorry, they're pretty comedic, but they're still really much in the Romero tradition. And then you get something like Dead Alive by Peter Jackson, which is just off the wall, no holds barred. And then you get to Shaun of the Dead. Shaun of the Dead is probably the first really sophisticated zombie because it plays with the expectations, it plays with the tropes, it's able to make jokes because the audience knows the joke is inside. But the ending of the film is tragic. It's awful. It's traumatic. It's traditional. And something like Anne and the Apocalypse is the same way. The first half is a comedy. It's a musical comedy, and it's funny and it's silly, and we make fun of the zombies and we make fun of the people surviving, and we may even make fun of the people who get killed. But the second half of that film is pretty dark, and it turns relatively tragic. And the music shifts, the musical quality and the subject matter shifts. And frankly, I was a little surprised. I thought it was going to be pretty silly up until the end, but it had a bleak ending. And to me personally, the final musical number missed. I think it's hard to maintain what it was trying to maintain. So I think the zombie comedy is really an essential part of the creature's development. And I think we're at a point where enough people are familiar enough with zombies that we can make fun of them, but not in a way that's dismissive. We can make fun of them in a way that we'll laugh, but also think about it. And we'll maybe think about it for a few days later. And comedy has tremendous power for cultural awareness and cultural therapy and cultural change. But I think in a lot of ways it's harder. A zombie horror film's easy. And I've seen a bunch of them, low budget ones, uninspired ones. They're still effective. They're still scary and startling. Zombie comedies are hard because comedy is hard. Sophisticated comedy is hard. Otherwise, it's just jokes. And it's the satire and the irony and the sophistication that we need to see more of. Not a lot's been written about zombie comedies. So that's another area where scholars, I think, have more work to do.
Yeah, thank you. That's I think that's very interesting what you said about the connection between horror and comedy. And I think that you can see that in the way that many directors and writers and creators who are very good at comedy, they tend to go into horror at some point in their careers.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
Paula.
Hello. Well, Dr. Bishop, before anything else, thank you so very much for such an insightful talk. This has been so very enlightening. And as for my question, I am particularly interested in the role of nostalgia in post-apocalyptic fiction. And I was wondering if you could comment on the relation between the zombie and this almost mythical return home, which is particularly relevant when thinking of trauma and memory So I was wondering, is this a thing, the nostalgic zombie? And well, right now I can only think of Colson Whitehead's The Stragglers in Zone 1, but I am sure there are other examples of this return to the familiar home spaces that in a way humanizes the zombie.
That is a great question. I think nostalgia is really essential for Gothic narratives. I think the Gothic is all based on nostalgia. Walpole was nostalgic to a fault. I think that's what gave rise to the Gothic originally. But there is a nostalgia in zombie films that's really tragic, and it's really painful. So on the one hand, Romero has always kind of explored the idea of nostalgia among his human survivor characters. The idea that the people trapped in a zombie apocalypse are understandably longing for the pre-zombie world. And so I think of Dawn of the Dead, where they so meticulously try to recreate normal life inside that shopping mall, where they make a home, they build a house, essentially. They have fun, they play, they do all the things they normally would do. But it's only the men. Francie gets that it's not going to go back to that. It's not going to be normal again. And so we get that increasingly in zombie narratives where people try to hang on to normalcy, to hang on to the past. But what the point you raise, which is so great, is this idea of the zombie as the nostalgic figure. And Colson Whitehead explores it quite a bit. The Girl with All the Gifts, the film, does an interesting play on it, with the characters kind of going about, the zombies kind of go about their business in tragic ways. I'm thinking particularly the woman who's pushing her baby coach. It's just really gut-wrenching and really, really sad. Some more recent films have played around with it quite a bit, where zombies talk. So there's the film Alone, which is the US version of the South Korean film Alive. The zombies just kind of wander around and make noises, and they repeat phrases from their existence, which I find really kind of disturbing. This idea that even though they're dead, they can't quite let go of the life they once had. Cargo is really disturbing as well, because you have zombies that are infected to the point where they lose their cognition, but they still kind of go through the motions in certain ways. And I think it's an important thing to explore, the idea where the dead can't be completely freed from their existence. And I think we're seeing more of that. I Am a Hero is a great Japanese film. I really like that one a lot more than I thought I would. It's from 2015. They speak and they act, but they can only do what they had when they died. They hang on to this last moment of existence. And that's where the zombie becomes such a powerful metaphor for modernity, because how many of us are doing it, particularly with COVID? We just kind of go through the motions. We just go through the motions hoping that things will get back to normal at some point. And so I find myself doing that at work, just kind of like, well, time to grade the papers. And I feel with Zoom and with everything that we're coping with, we're all zombies to a certain extent. And I think we all suffer from substantial nostalgia right now. It's like, I just want to go out with my friends. I want to see a movie in a movie theater. We miss the simple things that all sufferers of an apocalypse end up missing. And the goal is to regain some semblance of that lost life, whether we're human survivors or whether we're zombie victims. We want to reclaim that. And so nostalgia is the motivating factor of zombie movies. You nailed it. I mean, The Walking Dead is about nostalgia. Let's rebuild the government. Let's rebuild civilization. Let's rebuild trade and diplomacy. Let's rewrite the Constitution. What's interesting to me is the zombie narratives that say, let's return to what was, versus the zombie narratives that say, now is our chance to build something new. Because too much nostalgia is dangerous. And I think we're going to see in our real world, I think life is not going to return to what it was before the pandemic, nor should it. And so nostalgia also always has to be tempered with pragmatism. And I think the zombie narrative allows us to explore those risks more safely. So great question.
Well, thank you so much. And yes, absolutely. I do think the same thing. Thank you so much for your answer.
Thanks, Paula.
I think there are no more questions. Anna, usually we sort of conclude on a sort of group thank you, right?
Yep. So that we can thank you.
Yeah, so
thank you very much.
No, thank you. I'm not surprisingly, I love to talk about this stuff. As Michael said, this has been the last 15 years of my life. So I love to share what I've learned. I love the questions. That's how I get new ideas. I love having an audience, and you all have been so gracious, and it's nice to see faces and to feel like I'm part of something, since we can't really conference like we used to. So I very much appreciate the invitation, and I'm honored to be part of this series that you all have put together. It's great work.